And now, a story from the Appleseed.
When I was a little girl, I had a little red tricycle that was my older brother Gary's, then my brother Chris's, and then mine. And growing up, you didn't just get a bike because you outgrew it. You got a bike at Christmas or your birthday. And so I would ride that thing up and down the driveway, and my knees would hit the bars until there were bruises. I mean, when I would get a bath, there would be little bruises on the top of my knees. But I loved it so much. I could go so fast on it and push back on the pedal on the driveway and leave black marks like a race car driver. It was the best thing ever. It had little confetti long pieces of plastic hanging off the handlebars. I loved it. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth on the driveway. My mom would say, Kimmy, you are too young to go on to the road. Not because we lived in a high traffic area, but there was a lot of farm equipment and some guys with trucks that went fast. We were kind of spread out, so it wasn't like a nice little tight neighborhood. It could be a little dangerous, especially if your kid not paying attention. Well, just like that tricycle, I outgrew the driveway. You can only go up and down a driveway so long until you are absolutely tired of it. And little boy, what I'm about to say is not anything that you should do. Okay? Good job. Cover. To what? You go on the road? Oh, great. That's great. That's good. Then I can't get in trouble if you do that. I have liability insurance just in case. Well, one day I was going up and down that driveway, and I thought, I am just done with this. It's almost like a torture going up and down this driveway, not being able to go onto the road. And so I went to the end of the driveway up by the road and came to a stop as I turned around, and I looked. Every single window. No mom. Thursday was a big cleaning day, and I'm like, she's busy. So I took and I pushed those pedals so hard and went so fast, got to the end of the driveway, did a quick look, and I went off that black macadam driveway onto that stony, worn gray road, circled around in a U, and came back on, came to a stop, my heart pounding in my chest, looked up at the house. No mother. I did it again, slipped off the edge, almost took it into the ditch, came back around, pedaled down, turned, looked up. No mother. But then I heard it. At the end of the driveway, I heard, girl, you best behave, or Marcus Anthony Ramsey's going to get you. Standing at the end of the driveway was old Miss Murphy. Old Miss Murphy lived down the hill, and even standing on my driveway, I could look all the way down Farm Drive Hill and see her, because she spent every day of her life, unless it was really bad weather, sitting in a green slatted lawn chair, aluminum folding, by the mailbox. Tissue sticking out of her bra sleeve side, out of the end of her sweaters, even standing there in front of me at the end of that driveway in that pink crocheted sweater, there was a tissue in her watch. There was a tissue coming out of here. She had tissues out of everywhere. Maybe it's what she was made of. I don't know. But I sat there thinking, what is she talking about? I didn't know anybody in the whole area named Marcus Anthony Ramsey. And she'd turn and walk away. It was like that all the time. When I graduated to a regular bike, banana seat, sissy bar, 6 foot tall neon flag, Cheerio box tops, clothing pinned to the wheel, brrr, making a motor noise. She still did it. One time I was down by Burke's barn and I was whipping rocks into the pond, because that's why God put them here. And I was throwing rocks into the pond and my hand was wet and one slipped. It took a direction that I did not intend and it took out a window of the barn. Now you gotta understand that where I lived in Amish country, farming and barns were a big deal, and I was petrified. I got on my bike and I thought, I'm just going home. As I went by her, she leaned out of her seat and she said, naughty, naughty, naughty. You best make that right, or Marcus Anthony Ramsey's going to get you. I pedaled as fast as I could, and I thought, she is crazy. I don't know what she's talking about. And then one Saturday morning, I was out selling potholders with pure intentions. And I was making some money. And as I headed home, I went by her place, and she leaned out and she goes, dirty money. You better make that right, or Marcus Anthony Ramsey's going to get you. And I'm like, how could she know? Did she hear the coins jingling in my basket that I had thrown in there from my filthy lucre from selling my potholders under false pretenses to people in the neighborhood? I thought, what in the world? And then I got old enough where I had a boyfriend. And I had a boyfriend. And we were down by his house and we were running around and playing. And I was Angie Dickinson and he was Kojak, and that was cool. And if you are of a certain age, you don't know what I'm talking about and you are missing out. Let me just tell you. How can you not love a guy that's always eating a lollipop? That's like the perfect man. That's what he did. He always ate lollipops, Kojak. So anyways, he gave me a kiss on the cheek, my first kiss on the cheek, Chris Markle. And I was Angie Dickinson, and he was Kojak. Like, this is just a rom-com waiting to happen. And I was driving my bike home, riding it. As a kid, you really feel I'm driving. I was riding my bike home, and I was on cloud 9. I was like, I have a boyfriend. This was so romantic. I can't believe it. And as I went by her, she said, naughty, naughty, naughty. I know what you've been doing. You best make that right, or Marcus Anthony Ramsey's going to get you. That was it. I slammed on the brakes. I drove that bike into the grass and let it drop. I walked over and then stood in front of her, looking down at her in that little slatted green chair, and I said, Miss Murphy, I'm grown up now. I have a boyfriend, and I'm tired of you trying to scare me. She said, girl. She reached up and pulled a bobby pin out of her hair, started to clean her ear. She said, I ain't been trying to scare you. She said, I've been trying to warn you. She put the bobby pin back. And I said, what? I said, I know everybody that lives around here, and there's no Marcus Anthony Ramsey. She said, girl, he's here, but he ain't living. Sit down. Well, that's all I needed to hear. I dropped in the dirt, cross-legged, and I sat there. She said, I'm going to tell you a story. She said, my mama, now understand, at this point, I'm a little kid at 11 or 12. At that time, she was 80. So when she says her mama, we're talking like, before the wheel. And she said, when my mama was a young lady, there was a boy that went to their very small school that she loved. His name was Marcus Anthony Ramsey. Marcus Anthony Ramsey had a long shock of hair across his face, a sharp, protruding hooked nose, very skinny, willowy young man. And even though she was in love with him, she thought he was mysterious, he didn't want anything to do with her. He really had no family. Some people in the area kept him. None of us really talked about where his family was. But he had no time for her. He only had time for one thing, and that was the cemetery. Every day after school, he'd head to the cemetery. He would dig graves, he'd fill graves, he'd weed, he'd clean, he'd edge the dirt, stone little paths that went through there. He'd plant flowers if he was supposed to plant flowers. He'd remove dead flowers, and he'd work as an assistant of sorts to the cemetery sexton. Back in the day, cemetery sextons actually lived in the cemetery in a small cottage, and that cottage was there on top of the highest hill at the Pency Cemetery near where I grew up. I mean, like a short bike ride away. She said, my mother pined for him a long time and then finally had to let it go. Not only did he not have any room for a romance, but he didn't even have a social life. For two reasons. One, he didn't want one. He spent all of his time in the cemetery. Even when he wasn't working at the cemetery, you could find him sitting there reading books. And she said, and honestly, everybody was okay with that because they thought he was a little weird. This kid, no family. Somebody had to take him in. He's a little strange looking, always hanging out in the cemetery. And so as time went by, the cemetery sexton passed away. And when he did, Marcus Anthony Ramsey was in his mid-20s. And they said, you know what? This is the perfect job for him. Nobody else knows the cemetery like he does. And he needs his own place. It comes with a little house. And he's going to do a fine job. And so that is how Marcus Anthony Ramsey became the new cemetery sexton of the Pency Cemetery. He loved it. He had 3 boys because the cemetery had grown. Obviously, they all do. The cemetery had grown. Never thought of that before, did you? The cemetery had grown, and so now he had 3 assistants, boys that went to the school nearby, and they would do the jobs that he used to do. Digging and filling, planting and getting rid of dead flowers and edging and laying stone on the pathways, just the odd jobs, cleaning the cemetery tombstones and things like that. Because now Marcus Anthony Ramsey, he had a different job. He had to handle the finances. He had to deal with grieving families. And he did a fine job. People married. People had babies. Houses rose up. Things changed around town, but the whole time, apart from it all, was Marcus Ramsey up in the little house in the cemetery minding his own business. Now, my mom used to have a saying. She said, sometimes people are born oddly bent. And she also said that sometimes people are born and become oddly bent because of the cards they're dealt or the people they have to deal with. And he definitely was a little oddly bent. And as time went on, things got even stranger. He always took care of things. As a matter of fact, the ladies from the Historical Society went up there all the time. And they would check on things and make sure that the graves looked proper. And then once a year, they would actually do an audit. And he would leave that little cottage and he'd put his paperwork and his bookkeeping on the desk and they would check it and they would get done and say everything is perfect. All of the cemetery plots match where they're supposed to be according to the names of what we have on the map. All the money is accounted for, every I dotted, every T crossed. There is nothing strange about that place except for him, Marcus Anthony Ramsey. But if they would have looked a little closer, they would have found something. Because things had shifted. For years, Marcus Anthony Ramsey kept to himself in that cemetery, in that house, doing his job. But in just the later years, he started coming into town. People wouldn't even know he was there. He would come out from a corner, or he'd be sitting at a table in a shadowed area, and when he would rise up to leave, they'd say, "Did you even know that he was there?" And another odd thing that he started doing, he started getting the newspaper and walking around the cemetery, reading the newspaper, walking the paths and reading the newspaper. And the boys that helped him said, and just not long ago, he started talking to us a lot more, asking us questions about everybody in town. It's strange. He used to just kind of ignore us. All kinds of odd things like this began to happen. And that's when he took a turn. And if those ladies would have looked a little closer, if they would have pushed a chair over to the bookshelf and got up and stood on their tiptoes and felt around, they would have felt another roll of paper, tightly wound, twine tied. And if they would have opened it and laid it on his desk, they would have noticed that that map was of the cemetery. And it looked exactly like the one that they looked at for their audit, except on this one, there weren't just the names of the dead. There were also the names of some living, which that's normally okay because many people like to prepare ahead of time. But on this one, there were a lot of names that were still living. People who'd never put a penny down on their plot. If they would have looked closer, they would have seen that that map had a hard line down the middle, marked east and west. Marcus Anthony Ramsey, over time, not interacting with any of those people except for their death, which we pass over our death day every year. We don't even know what it is, but we do. Had kind of turned inward to himself. And when you can control the end of life of where people lie, sometimes you can really start to judge. And Marcus Anthony Ramsey began to gather information on everybody in town, and he started to not wait till they died to decide where they were going to be buried. He decided that he would determine where they'd be buried. The west side of the cemetery had rolling hills, beautiful trees, and birdsong. The east side was a little unsettling, shadowed, kind of bare trees that just never seemed to want to bloom, rocky. And it even went flat on the edge. And the other thing is that the Pency Railroad, right on the border of that cemetery, came through and made a hard curve. He would gather information about people and he would sit in the low light of that little cottage and he would make judgment. If he had gathered enough information on you that he felt you deserved reward, he would mark your name on the west side of the cemetery, where you'd be buried with the trees and the birdsong and the flowers. And when you passed away, he'd say, "Oh, I knew you'd be coming. I heard what happened. I'm sorry, and I have the perfect plot." And he'd show them, and they'd buy it. But if he'd gotten enough information about you that he felt you did not deserve any reward, he would say, "Oh, I have the perfect spot." And he would plant those people on the west side, where the train would come through and rattle the bones in the grave so they'd never rest in peace. He would walk through the cemetery at night, reading the newspaper, collecting all the information that he could, and then he'd fold it, tuck it underneath his arm, stand on the highest hill, looking towards the east. He could hear the sound of the train coming down the tracks. He could see its one eye slicing through the trees. And he'd stand there as the train would take that curve. Smudged sky, steel wheels on Goldman track, dirt dancing on stone, and he'd lift his head up and he'd think, I can hear the headbones rattling in the grave. I am the greatest judge of all. Well, what he forgot was, death comes to all of us, even if we think we have a handle on it. Just like the plumber who doesn't fix their own drip, or the cobbler who doesn't have, yes, because, cobblers are a big thing now in 2024. Just like the cobbler whose kids don't have shoes. Marcus Anthony Ramsey was so wrapped up in judging everybody's own death and their life that he forgot that it happens to him and would happen to him. Miss Mealy had just laid to rest her dearly departed husband, Henry. Perfect plot on the west side. As she tapped in her Sunday shoes through the stone pathway with her arm on the crook of her hand, she thought to herself, oh, maybe if I get it just right, I can stand on my tiptoes and see that weird Marcus Anthony Ramsey in his cottage. As she turned on the path, she stood on her tiptoes and she saw him, splayed across the desk, eyes wide open, ink spilled all over a piece of paper that had been unrolled, a pencil still in his hand. She called the women at the Historical Society. It's the only people she knew to call. And she said, you're not going to believe what I just saw. I said, we need to get help. We need to call somebody. Marcus Anthony Ramsey is dead. Nobody knew what they were going to do. There was no family. So the women that did the audit normally every year went up into the cottage and they cleaned up. After the body was removed, of course. That piece of parchment paper, they didn't even know what that was. It was covered in ink, smeared, and they threw that away. They pulled out the plot map that they normally saw along with the books, and they took that down into the town council. And while they were there, they talked about where are we going to bury him. They looked at the plot map, the public plot map, and his name wasn't on it. They said, well, let's walk the grounds and make a decision and see if we can find a good place for him to rest. And so they did. They walked the cemetery. And as they were walking, one of them said, oh, don't you remember? Don't you remember sometimes when we drive by, you could see him standing when the train would come by? His head lifted high and a smile on his face. He loved the train. And I think we need to plant him by that oak tree right where the train takes the curve. That's a wonderful idea, they all agreed. Miss Murphy leaned forward in her chair and she said, girl, he's up there and he's buried on the wrong side of that cemetery. And he's madder than a rooster in a rainstorm. And he's just waiting for you to do something wrong so he can come and get you. If you're listening to this on audio, they jumped in fear. She said, if you go up there and you press your ear into his grave when the train comes by, you can hear it. You can hear his head bone rattle. I jumped up and I started running for my bike. He'd never rest in pieces. And she cackled and threw her head back. I jumped on my bike, pedaled up to the house, dropped it in the grass, went in, got in on that avocado phone that was attached to the wall. And I called my two best friends, told them the story. And I said, she said that if we get up there before it's dark, we can listen to the head bone rattling in the grave when the train comes by. It was minutes before they were in my driveway. I went out and I met them, the sky getting dusky dark, threaded with electricity as rain began to pelt our bodies. We rode our bikes up to those big iron gates, dropped our bikes, and we ran down the now cemented path. All I could hear was the pounding of our feet on the pavement and our hearts in our chests beating and thumping. We took that hard turn to the east side, slipping and sliding on the grass, making our way down to the big oak tree. We knew where it was, and when we got there, breathing heavy sweat mingling with rain, I read on that tombstone, Marcus Anthony Ramsey, and I thought, it's real. And just then I heard the train. I looked at my friends and I'm like, who's going to get on the grave and listen? They just looked at me. And that's when I realized that when you hear the story, it's your responsibility. I got to the bottom of the grave and dropped to my knees, damp earth pushing through to my skin. I crawled onto that grave that had been sunken down like the palm of God himself had passed his judgment. I laid and nested into it, and I turned my head, pushed my ear into the ground, and I waited, and I saw the train coming, and as it passed, I heard it. I heard the headbone rattle in the grave. When the train comes through our town, whistle makes a mournful sound. Down there by them old railroad rails, them bones sing like a rattler's tale. Listen to that whistle scream, wake the dead and haunt my dreams. Sounds just like a lost soul's moan. Listen to them a-rattling bones. 3 feet wide and 6 feet deep. Poor old souls don't get no sleep. Lay your ear next to the ground, yeah, and hear them old bones rattle round. They say the dead don't make no sound. They do when that train comes around. Down there by them old railroad rails, just like a rattler's tail. 3 feet wide and 6 feet deep. Poor old souls don't get no sleep. Lay your ear next to the ground, yeah, and hear them old bones rattle round. Head bone rattles on the neck bone rattles on the backbone, backbone rattles on the hip bone rattles on the thigh bone rattles on the knee bone rattles on the shin bone rattles on the ankle bone rattles on the foot bone rattles on the toe bone. Ooh, ooh.
Thanks for joining us for a story from the Appleseed.